This is the most repeated fact about geomythology you'll ever hear, and the science behind it just fell apart. For 30 years, the story has gone like this. Long before anyone had the word dinosaur, ancient people were digging up monsters. They pulled impossible bones out of the ground, skulls too big, shapes too wrong, creatures that matched nothing alive. And they did the only thing a human mind can do with evidence it can't explain. They told a story. A giant, a dragon, a one-eyed cannibal in a cave. The myth was never a fantasy, it was a field report. The crown jewel of that idea was the Griffin, the eagle-headed lion that guarded gold in the mountains of Central Asia. The claim went that Scythian miners kept stumbling onto the bones of a beaked, four-legged creature out in the Gobi and carried the description west until it hardened into legend. It's a beautiful story. It's in museums, it's in documentaries, and it's been told 1,000 times as settled fact. In 2024, 2 paleontologists took it apart. And here's the strange part. That's not the end of this idea. It's the beginning of the real one. While the most famous monster from a fossil story was quietly collapsing, several others were turning out to be rock solid. Skulls you can still walk up to and look at. Misidentifications we can catch in the historical record red-handed, with a date attached. So this is the line we're going to walk. Which of humanity's monsters were genuinely misread fossils? And which are just stories we wanted so badly to be true that we stopped checking? We start with the one that fooled the experts. Let's start with why the Griffin story was so easy to believe. In the 1990s, a folklorist named Adrian Mayer, a research scholar at Stanford University, noticed something nobody had taken seriously before. The Griffin, that lion-bodied, eagle-beaked guardian of gold, didn't behave like other Greek monsters. It had no gods for parents. It told no real story of its own. It just sat there in the art, described again and again as a four-legged beast with a beak, nesting on the ground, out east near the gold. And out east, in the Gobi Desert, there is a four-legged beast with a beak, Protoceratops, a ceratopsian dinosaur, the same broader group as Triceratops, a sheep-sized animal with a parrot-like bill and a bony frill that, in a weathered skull, can read like the beginnings of wings. Mayer's idea was elegant. Scythian nomads prospecting for gold found these skeletons eroding out of the red rock, and the description traveled west along the trade routes until the Greeks were painting a monster they'd never seen. It's the kind of explanation that feels true the moment you hear it. It put dinosaurs and ancient myth in the same sentence. It went into a major museum exhibition, and it became the example everyone reaches for. And then, in 2024, 2 paleontologists at the University of Portsmouth, Mark Witten and Richard Hing, did something nobody had bothered to do. They checked it. Their findings were published in interdisciplinary science reviews. The Griffin, it turns out, has a paper trail. It shows up in Egyptian and Middle Eastern art more than 1,000 years before the Greeks supposedly heard about it from Scythian miners, which is a problem, because you can't inherit a monster from a story you haven't been told yet. The art itself gives the game away too. The Griffins are unmistakably built from lions and eagles. The muscles, the long flexible tail, the mane, and they look nothing like a squat little dinosaur. And the goal, the whole hook of the legend, is that griffins guard it. But Protoceratops fossils sit hundreds of kilometers from the nearest known gold deposits. The two things were never in the same place. Other paleontologists had quietly doubted it for years. Mark Norell, who helped curate that famous museum exhibit, came to see it as entertainment more than evidence. So the crown jewel was glass. And it leaves us with a sharp, uncomfortable question. If the most famous case is the weakest, how do we tell a real fossil monster from a story that just feels right? The answer is to find a monster where the bones are still on the table, which is exactly what we have with the Cyclops. The Cyclops is where this idea stops being a nice story and starts being hard to argue with. Here's the problem the ancient Greeks were handed. Scattered across the Mediterranean islands, Sicily, Malta, Cyprus, Crete, were skulls. Big ones, bigger than a man's head, far heavier, made of dense old bone, and shaped wrong in one specific, unforgettable way. Dead center in the face, where you'd expect a nose, there was a single enormous hole. Those skulls belonged to dwarf elephants, ice age elephants that shrank, generation after generation, into something the size of a large pig, because island life punishes anything that eats too much. The Sicilian species, Paleoloxodon falconeri, got so small it would barely reach your waist. By the time Greek settlers arrived, the elephants were long gone, but their skulls were still turning up in caves and hillsides. And the Greeks had never seen an elephant. They had no trunk to explain that hole. What they had was a skull twice the size of their own, with one gaping socket in the middle of the forehead. You already know what they built from it. In 1914, an Austrian paleontologist named Othenio Abel laid it out plainly. That central cavity, which on a living elephant holds the trunk, reads to an eye that's never seen an elephant as one colossal eye socket. Set it in a skull bigger than any human head, surround it with the giant's other massive bones, and you have not just a giant, but a one-eyed giant, Polyphemus, the man-eater in the cave, the creature Homer put at the center of the Odyssey. Now compare this to the Griffin, because the difference is the whole point. The Griffin failed on geography. The bones and the legend were never in the same place. The Cyclops passes that exact test. The skulls were on the same islands the Greeks said the monsters lived on. They genuinely resemble what the myth describes. And the misreading isn't a stretch you have to talk yourself into. Show that skull to anyone today who doesn't know what an elephant is, and watch where their eye goes first. It's not airtight. One-eyed giants show up in cultures that never had a dwarf elephant to dig up. So the skulls didn't invent the Cyclops from nothing. More likely, they fed a monster that was already half-formed and gave it a face. But that's the honest shape of a strong case. Not, this fossil created this myth, but this fossil is sitting right where the myth grew, looking exactly like the thing people swore they'd found. The Greeks found a face in the rock. Now we go to a place where people found a whole dragon, and we can name the year they did it. With the Cyclops, we're reconstructing how a misreading probably happened thousands of years ago. With the dragon of Klagenfurt, we don't have to guess. We can practically watch it happen, with a date on it. Klagenfurt is a city in southern Austria, and long before the city existed, there was a legend. The marshes along the river were said to hold a winged dragon, a lindworm, that preyed on livestock and travelers, until a duke baited it with a bull on a hook and his knights cut it down. Standard founding myth. The dragon became the city's symbol, its coat of arms, its identity, a story, and nothing more. Then, in 1335, workers in a quarry outside town pulled an enormous skull out of the rock. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. It was massive, ancient, unmistakably the head of some great beast. And the town already had a beast on the books, so they did the obvious thing. They decided this was the lindworm. Proof, at last, dug straight out of the ground. The supposed dragon skull was kept and treasured for centuries. Here's the part that turns a folktale into something remarkable. In 1590, a sculptor was commissioned to carve the dragon for a fountain in the town square, and he used that skull as his anatomical reference, building the monster's head to match the real bone in front of him. The Klagenfurt dragon is often called the first reconstruction of an extinct animal in history, a real fossil used as a model to rebuild a creature that no longer walked the earth. They just had the wrong creature, because the skull, of course, was not a dragon. It took until the 1800s for naturalists to identify it, a woolly rhinoceros, an Ice Age survivor whose remains had ended up in that quarry tens of thousands of years before. The dragon of Klagenfurt was a rhino, with a head start on legend. And this pattern repeats everywhere you look, once you know the shape of it. The giants and titans of Greek myth, the heroes of impossible size buried in the hills, line up with the bones of mastodons and mammoths, enormous proboscideans whose massive limb bones, dug up and laid out, look startlingly like the skeleton of a human, scaled to monstrous proportions. Different continent, different monster, same human reflex. Find the bone, then build the body that fits it. Which brings us back to where we started, and to what the Griffin was really trying to teach us all along. So go back to the Griffin one last time, because by now it means something different. When those two paleontologists at the University of Portsmouth took the Griffin apart in 2024, It would have been easy to read it as a debunking of the whole idea, proof that linking monsters to fossils is just romantic nonsense. But that's not what happened. They weren't attacking the idea that ancient people built myths from bones. They were defending it. Their whole point was that the idea is too important to hand to the weakest example. A real connection needs the bones and the legend in the same place, looking like each other, with history backing it up. The Griffin doesn't clear that bar. The Cyclops does. The Dragon of Klagenfurt clears it so completely we can name the quarry. And that's the real story here. Not that ancient people were fools who saw monsters in rocks, but the opposite. They were the first paleontologists. They found genuine physical evidence of creatures that no longer existed. They examined it, and they reasoned from it. They reconstructed a body to fit the bones in front of them, sometimes literally carving it in stone. They got the answer wrong, because they were missing the one thing we now take for granted: deep time, and the knowledge that the Earth is stacked with the dead of vanished worlds. Strip that framework away, and a woolly rhinoceros skull is a dragon. Of course it is. What else could it be? The dragons were never lies. They were data without a theory. Honest reports filed by people doing forensics with the wrong manual. And the monsters they built are the fossil record's first drafts. Written before anyone knew that's what they were reading. So the next time you see that confident little caption under a museum griffin telling you it came from a dinosaur, you'll know the truth is stranger than the myth. The famous story is the one that fell apart. And the quiet ones, the Cyclops skull and the rhino dragon in the Austrian square, are the ones that turned out to be real. We didn't invent monsters because we couldn't see the world clearly. We invented them because we were looking very closely at something we didn't yet have the words for.